Hello, ladies and gents. Welcome to part 3 of our evolution notes. Today we're going to go into what exactly is the evidence for evolution. So evolution is a theory. Remember that a theory means that it's been supported by multiple lines of evidence. So down below are some of our lines of evidence. So we use our fossil record, homologous body structures, vestigial structures, embryology, geographic distribution, and biochemical evidence, which includes DNA, genetics. So we're going to go into each one of these and how they are an evidence for evolution, and just keep in mind what evolution is change over time. So here we go. The fossil record. So when it comes to the fossil record, we have found lots and lots of fossils. When you look at fossils, the oldest fossils are always in the lowest layers of the sediment and newer ones at the top. Now this is as long as the ground is stable, okay? So this makes sense because older things, the different layers get piled up on top of it over time, and if you died more recently, then the sediment is not going to be as high on you. So over time, we have these different layers of rock that our fossils get buried in. And when we look at these fossils through these different geologic times, that we can see how life forms have changed through history. Now, there are many, many gaps in the fossil record, and there probably always will be, because fossils are essentially very rare. Just because we have not found one yet doesn't mean it didn't exist. So you have to have certain conditions, which you should have learned about when you took earth science, in order for fossils to even to occur. The body has to be undisturbed to begin with, which is rare in nature. All right, and it has to lay there long enough to have all the sediment bury it over time, and then it becomes fossilized. So we can look at these and look at the change. And some of the fossils that we find are called transitional fossils, like this guy down here. This is Tiktaalik. This is the cast of the actual fossil. Tiktaalik was one of those transitional ones that for a long time people argued, well, if life began in the ocean, how did it land up on land? We didn't see any fossils of organisms that were transitioning from an aquatic environment to a land environment. And Tiktaalik was one of the first, and we found some since as well. But Tiktaalik was one of the first that showed this transition. And so one of the things you see in these animals that are transitioning to land is in the fins, there are now bones, all right, like phalanges, like your fingers, inside there. And the fossil kind of shows that. And also, if you look where the eyes are, they're on the top of the head, like alligators are. And so were these little nares here. So this guy very obviously was going up on land, but in the back of him looks very, very aquatic. But there are some rudimentary legs coming down here at the bottom. And we used to have animals alive today that show a similar body plan that are kind of intermediate between an aquatic environment and land, like mud skippers would be one example. And I'm going to post this little video for you below the lecture so you can check that out. So how do we know how old these fossils are? Well, there's two different ways to date things. There's relative dating and there's radioactive dating. So relative dating is what we typically use when we're talking about fossils that are older, and we're looking at what layer of rock were they found in, and we can then date the rock and know approximately what age frame, geological time scale that rock was produced in, and that gives us a general range of when the fossil was probably produced. And so this is not as accurate. You can't really pinpoint a year or anything like that. But you can get a general idea of how old something is. Now, much better than that is radioactive. So if something is radioactive, all natural things, you have some radioactivity in your body just from the elements that we bring in from our environment. And as long as we're alive and we're bringing in new elements, we stay at the same level of radioactivity, which is pretty low, but same level. So like carbon is a great example, carbon dating. We have a certain percentage of radioactive carbon in our body, and when you die, you're not bringing in any new carbon from the foods that we consume, and so your carbon slowly degrades down into regular old carbon-12. And that is how we date it. We know how many years it takes for half of your carbon to go away. That's your half-life. And so we can measure, we know the approximate percentage of a body that is radioactive carbon, and so they can measure how much radioactive carbon is left over in those in whatever relic or body that they happen to find. and they can calculate how old it is using those half-lives. And so this is extremely accurate. And of course, there's different elements that we use, like carbon-14 is only really good for tens of thousands of years at best. So when you're talking about millions of years old fossil and rock strata, you need to use other elements for that. And I will post a link to a PhET activity below that you can check out. This shows exactly how we measure these things and what elements you would use. So another thing that we use are homologous body structures. So we've seen this root word homo already in this class a whole bunch of times. It means the same. So these are body structures where the structure is the same. It might be modified, but it's basically the same structure, but we use the limbs differently. So here I have a human, a cat, a whale, and a bat. Humans use their arm for grasping, cats walk on their leg, whales swim, and bats fly. So they're all using them for different purposes, but internally they're very much the same. You see the same pattern. You have one bone, two bone, blobbies, and phalanges down here, right? So one bone, two bone, blobbies, phalanges, one bone, two bones, blobbies, phalanges, one bone, two bone, blobbies, phalanges. The same pattern, modified because of how they're using it, but still the same layout. And what this tells us is the common ancestor of all these organisms, which are all mammals, probably had one bone, two bone, blobbies, phalanges, because they all have it. And so they must have got this trait from their common ancestor at some point. The opposite of homologous is analogous. Analogous is when organisms are using it the same way, but the structure is different. So it means that even though they're converging, it's convergent evolution, even though they're converging, they are not related. So now I have a bat again, and a bird, and an insect wing. All three of these guys are using these wings for flying, except internally the structure is very different. Now the bat and the bird, not as different. You still have one bone, two bones, and then phalanges, though the birds are highly modified. But they both have bones. But then when you look at the insect, insects do not have bones, all right? They have other little proteins in there that help keep the rigid structure in their wings, but no bones are there. And so this does not show common ancestry at all. Then we got vestigial organs. Vestigial organs are really cool. They're organs that we no longer use, and in the rule in nature is if you don't use it, you lose it, okay? Because it takes energy to build these body structures, and if you're not going to use them, it just turns into a burden energetically to your body. And it's not that we as individuals can, but a population over time can do this. So the last week, I had you guys watch a thing about whale evolution. So this is the ancestor of all whales over here. And over time, if you look at, and we have fossils of all these different whales, right? And this last one, he lived in the Ice Age. You'll notice how much they've changed. So that you started with like the face narrowing, becoming more aerodynamic, so they're better swimmers. The legs can be tucked up. They became webbed, all right? And then over time, the legs got reduced, and at this point, they have to be fully aquatic at this point. And then smaller and smaller, and then current day whales still have a little tiny pelvis and a little tiny femur in there that's in their blubber. And then you can see it over here in this actual skeleton that are the remnants of their back hind legs. Now, if there was some kind of environmental pressure for whales to get up on land again, say another big predator came around, the whales that had the biggest femurs in there where they could actually nudge themselves up onto the sand and off of the sand as needed would be the ones with the advantage. And over time, natural selection could work backwards and select for whales to produce legs again, and it would kind of go backwards. But there must have been a pressure for them to go in the water. Probably they were finding food there, is what I imagine. Other things that are vestigial are like your appendix. So as humans, we don't use our appendix anymore. We'll talk about that more in a little bit. Your tailbone, humans' ancestors, if you go back far enough, did have a tail, and that's why we have a tailbone. All right, and as a matter of fact, every now and then, there's a person who's born with a tail that's left over from one of these vestigial organs. And even your wisdom teeth. Our wisdom teeth were from a time that we had to grind and chew our food. Well, now all our food is processed. We don't really need those things anymore. and more people are being born that do not develop all of their wisdom teeth or any at all. So here's the appendix thing. So if you look at a human down here, our appendix is tiny because we eat very little rough plant diet. Most of our stuff is processed or easily digested. And so your appendix is for bacteria to live in to help you digest the cellulose and the plant material. So if you look at like a possum that's an omnivore, they have a decent sized appendix. A kangaroo is a grazer, so they have quite large appendix. A koala is eating very rough foliage with that eucalyptus, so theirs is huge to help them get nutrients out of that food source. Rabbits are grass eaters, quite large. Zebra grass eater, quite large. And so we are obviously not eating that diet anymore. And because it's become vestigial, it actually has become a problem for us in that it is so small that it's not really useful anymore and just big enough that basically a little bit of debris can get in there, a little poo particles, and that could cause an infection. And then you have appendicitis, and if that ruptures, it could kill you. Then let's talk about embryology. This is the study of embryos, and when we look at embryos very early on in development, there's some interesting things going on. So here's a real embryo down here. That's a human embryo. So all of you guys looked like this once upon a time, all right, very early on in development during the first trimester. So when we look at, here's a fish, a reptile, a bird, and a human. Early on in development, they look very similar. And if you look at some things that they all have what's called a notochord. So notochords are what would turn into our spinal cord that runs down our back. And so all of them have a notochord. They also all have a tail. Now in humans, as we develop, this tail gets reabsorbed, okay? In birds, it gets quite reduced. Reptiles keep theirs, and of course, fish, it turns into a fin. So as we develop, this is modified, but you guys all had a tail at one point, and we also all have tail bones. So that tells us our common ancestor at some point had these characteristics. And then let's look at the really weird one, gill slits. All right, you all had gill slits when you were in your first trimester. All right, fish obviously keep theirs. They turn into functioning gills, but none of the other ones keep their gill slits, and actually they turn into various other bones and arches, even things in our ears as we develop. All right, but it is very cool that we all had gills at some point, gill slits. And every now and then, and I couldn't find a picture of this one, every now and then there's a human born that has the little slits on their neck from where the gill slits were because they did not disappear the way they were supposed to during development. They don't have functioning gills. There's no humans born with functioning gills. That would be very traumatic. But they do have like the openings there, so it's very interesting. So here is a baby who is born with a tail. So if you're born with a tail, it's not really a big deal. You just could get it removed because you don't need it. And so it's a little plastic surgery there when they're a little bit older. Right? This little boy also was born with a little tail. And he is actually in India where they worshipped him as a monkey god because of his tail. Now, geographic distribution is an interesting one. It's not the very best evidence of evolution, but it is one. And this has to do with the fact that at one point, all of our continents were together in a supercontinent called Pangaea. Over time, the continents split into what we know today. When the continents split, different species of animals got isolated onto these continents. And so that drove evolution. And so we look for is patterns of where organisms are found. And so a good example are the bears. So when we look at where most bears live, they're across these top two continents which used to be connected. And the one bear that we find on both continents is the brown bear. And that leads us to believe that the brown bear was around when these continents were connected, and that these other bears, like the sloth bear and the spectacled bear and the black bear and the polar bear, may have come later and evolved from the grizzly bear or brown bear. And that's quite the possibility, actually, because one of the things that's happening is polar bears, as they lose habitat, are getting pushed back into habitat that overlaps with brown bears, and these guys have been able to hybridize So you have to be pretty closely related in order to do that. Then, of course, we have the very best evidence of evolution, which is biochemical evidence. This is looking at our genes and how similar they are or how different they are. And that shows common ancestors too, that we all have DNA and we can compare them. We can do the same thing with proteins as well. So the idea is that if you look everything compared to the human, all right, we're going to compare everything to a human in this case. And so between a human and a macaque, they look at a section of DNA and they find 8 differences, or a section of protein. And they find 8 differences. Versus us in a lamprey, which is a jawless fish, there's 125 differences. So the idea is that if there are less differences, you must be more closely related, just like your DNA is going to be most similar to your immediate family members, your mom, dad, sister, or brother, right? Versus you and your cousin, because your cousin has another relative, a mom or a dad, who is not blood related to you. And so that changes the genetics. So this would be like a sibling, this would be like a cousin, this would be like a second cousin, and so on. So the further back you go, the more differences you're going to have. So less differences, more closely related. Then let's talk a little about the pace of evolution. So there's 2 basic kind of plans for how evolution occurs. There is gradualism, which, like the name says, is slow and gradual change over time. And this is what most people picture when they imagine evolution occurring, is that you have this ancient species, so back here at the bottom with my butterfly, moth. And over time, for whatever reason, they start to get differences in the population, some variation. And they split off maybe in different habitats, maybe there was reproductive isolation, and they accumulate these slight differences over time until eventually they look vastly different and would no longer recognize each other as something to mate with, and they are considered separate species. But this is a slow and gradual change over time, which is what, like I said, we normally think of with evolution. But there is another path called punctuated equilibrium. So think of punctuation in a sentence, your periods and commas and stuff. You only use those every now and then. So this is like evolution that happens every now and then, but when it does happen, it happens quickly, okay? So basically, this occurs when your environment changes, and it's a very quick, hey, you have to be best fit or you die right away, and that will quickly change your population because it can create things like bottlenecks. And so down here at the bottom, here's my original moth, and he's pretty stable, and then something happened in the environment, and they broke off and had to change to survive. And then he's stable. This guy is stable all the way, and then let's say this group got isolated somewhere else, and they had to change rapidly to adapt, or they die. And so in the end, you land up with 3 species, all related to the original, and one of them looks a lot like them. So you could kind of imagine this with dogs per se. So this was the wolf, right? And then one broke off because humans selected traits, and then we selected other traits over here, and we got all the species of dogs, and it happened relatively quickly in terms of evolution. So this also occurred with some animals called the cichlids. So Lake Victoria is a relatively young lake in Africa. It's about 400,000 years old, which doesn't sound young, but when you're talking about the world being 6.5 billion years old, that's not much. And so Lake Victoria was formed in 1 year in Africa when there was a lot of rain. And the rivers overflowed. And when the rivers overflowed, 2 species of river cichlid, which are kind of dull and boring looking river cichlids, landed up in this lake isolated. And they had very few predators in there. And so what they could do is start competing with each other over resources. And they did divergent evolution, where they became very different, taking on different roles within this large body of water to take advantage of different food sources. And they also became wildly crazy colored, okay? And that's because of the lack of predators in there, that they could be brightly colored without attracting predators and getting dead. So when we look at cichlids today, you have this huge variety that all eat different things. They have bottom feeder cichlids, cichlids that feed on algae, cichlids that feed on other cichlids, cichlids that feed on eggs from other animals. There's all different kinds of cichlids, and they come in a huge variety of colors. And I will post a video for you about cichlids, so you can check that out, called The Strange Evolution of Cichlids. All right, hope you got all your notes, guys. Have a good one. Bye.